Alright, so as we know, popular culture can come in many forms, music, movies, memes, all sorts of things. And one thing that really defines popular culture is the narrative that's behind all of these different topics. So songs and shows, they all tell stories, and that's how they keep the audience interested. And one way that you can keep the audience interested, one thing that this succeeds at, is narrative coherence. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about narrative coherence. It's one of the topics from chapter 3 of the textbook. The artifact I'm using is from Silence of the Lambs, so we'll see a little bit more about that. I'm going to be talking specifically about how actors can help with narrative coherence. I'll be talking a little bit more generally at first so that we know exactly what narrative coherence is, so we can get a better understanding before I go more in depth about my specific artifact. So, as I said, we'll be looking at Anthony Hopkins' performance in Silence of the Lambs as Hannibal Lecter, and we'll be talking about how that succeeds at narrative coherence and how narrative coherence helps with popular culture. So, as I said previously, what I'm going to do first before I introduce you to my artifact is talk about my topic, which is narrative coherence, in a more general term before I go ahead and narrow it down specifically to how my artifact shows this. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about how the textbook defines narrative coherence. So the textbook defines it as the degree to which a story hangs together. So this is basically how plausible the story is. So when we look at narrative coherence, we want to look at how much any story follows what the audience expects it to be. Now, the textbook also gives us a couple ways that this can happen. Specifically, they talk about shows based in a newsroom. And the first thing that they talk about is focusing on actual events. So when you're talking about how you can get the audience to understand what's happening and believe that it's something that actually is happening, to get them more engaged in the story, one thing that you can do is to put things that are actually happening in the story. So one way this could happen is, for example, now that we have corona and masks are a more common thing, cartoons are having episodes where characters are wearing masks. This kind of brings that actual event into that cartoon series to draw the audience in a little bit more. Another thing is modeling after a typical setting. So for the newsroom one, this would be just having a typical set based on what you see in actual news broadcasts. So for something like, let's just say a cartoon, Bob's Burgers, is set in a restaurant. So it's set up stereotypically as how we, the audience, think that a restaurant is going to be set up. So what this does is, again, it just helps the audience to believe what they're seeing as something that's actually coherent with what they're expecting when they go into it. If you say we're going to go to a restaurant and then you go to something that doesn't look like what the audience is expecting a restaurant to be, it makes it harder to believe that that's actually what's happening in the story. Now the third thing, and this is what I'm going to be talking about more in depth, is portraying characters in a more stereotypical way. And this goes back to how we talked about the setting. So what this does is an actor will portray a character the way the audience is expecting that character to be portrayed. So if an actor is portraying an antisocial character, then they're not going to talk as much, they're going to be a lot quieter, they're not going to make as much eye contact because that's what the audience is expecting. So it makes it more believable to the audience that actor is the character. So it draws you into the story more, which is what we want when we're talking about narrative coherence, because we want people to be drawn into that story so it can be something that we think of when we talk about popular culture.
Oh, Agent Starling, you think you can dissect me with this blunt little tool?
No. I thought that your knowledge...
You're so ambitious, aren't you? Do you know what you look like to me with your good bag and your cheap shoes? You look like a rube. A well-scrubbed, hustling rube with a little taste. Good nutrition's given you some length of bone, but you're not more than one generation from poor white trash, are you, Agent Starling? And that accent you've tried so desperately to shed, pure West Virginia. What does your father do? Is he a coal miner? Does he stink of the land? You know how quickly the boys found you, all those tedious, sticky fumblings in the backseats of cars, while you could only dream of getting out, getting anywhere, getting all the way to the apple pie.
You see a lot, Doctor? And are you strong enough to point that high-powered perception at yourself? What about it? Why don't you look at yourself and write down what you see? Maybe you're afraid to.
A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. To see what a
Because you've got
son
more
of a bitch
dimension.
you can be.
Yeah, it's much more dimension to it.
Have you known any madmen? Other than those in our profession, I mean.
No,
There's names that leap to mind right
Yes,
away.
I know.
I mean by that, have you ever been in the back ward of an old asylum or?
No, but I've actually met a madman who's on the loose in London, and that's pretty scary.
Yeah.
And I had coffee with him one day. I realised how nuts he was. He never blinked. So I based
That's
lecture.
interesting.
Never blinked. Kept asking me questions. And before you could answer them, he'd ask you another one and another one. And in the end, it made you feel that you were in a different reality.
So at any given moment in talking with him, you didn't see the insanity?
No, you completely. It's like somebody I used to know, a woman who used to sort of kick you on the shins and then say, "Don't you have a sense of humour?" and smile. That kind of madness.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they could change reality for you, but those people can really manipulate you. I think Kathy Bates in Misery is the most brilliant piece of mad acting I've ever seen. You know?
Really? Yeah, sure.
Because
yeah.
I knew this woman in America. She was exactly like Kathy Bates in this film. You never know what you're going to do. You say you don't know how to handle them. You don't know how to.
So I just had you guys watch 2 clips. The first clip is Anthony Hopkins performing as Hannibal Lecter in the Silence of the Lambs movie. And the second clip is an interview with him where he talks about his inspiration for the character. Now, in the first clip, we notice a couple of things about his performance. One of them is that his character is very intense and very steady. He doesn't have a lot of emotion in his voice. He's very, like, a flat tone, the same thing, until he gets insulted, and then he snaps, he hisses. It's a little bit more of what we'd expect the stereotypical insane person to do. Now, in the interview, we see a little bit more of his inspiration. He talks about not only real insane people that he has met with and talked to, but also his inspiration of Kathy Bates in the movie Misery, where she also plays a mad person. Now, one thing that we see in common between these 2 movies, if you've ever seen Misery, is the very intense, steady tone that the 2 characters take until you insult them, when both of them will snap in different ways. Kathy Bates is a little bit different. She doesn't do the hissing and stuff that Hannibal Lecter does. But you can see that common thread in where he got that. And we can see that because Misery was such a success in the box office, that performance became part of the stereotype of what insane or mad people look like and sound like. So it's perpetuating that image, and by Anthony Hopkins taking that and portraying Hannibal Lecter in a similar way, it continues to perpetuate that, which just shows you how much influence pop culture really does have on our views of society. So, as we can see, narrative coherence is something that's really important when it comes to talking about pop culture. All of these stories that are successful when it comes to pop culture have narrative coherence throughout them. The biggest one that we focused on today was how actors portray characters in a way that the audience understands and expects, which is one of the big points of narrative coherence. So when we have movies like Silence of the Lambs, where Anthony Hopkins is portraying the character Hannibal Lecter in a way that the audience understands and is expecting, then the narrative coherence of the story overall is a lot more cohesive, because we're hitting one of those points of narrative coherency, making it so that the audience feels more into the story and they understand the perspective of the characters a little bit more. Now, one way that this is important in pop culture overall is the perpetuation of different stereotypes when it comes to how characters are portrayed. Now, we talked a little bit about this in how Anthony Hopkins based part of his portrayal of Hannibal Lecter on Kathy Bates' performance in the movie Misery. Now, one thing that this does is that it means that in future pop culture performances, these stereotypes continue to be perpetuated. So, as we can see based on this artifact and what we've talked about a little bit so far, narrative coherence is something that's really important when it comes to pop culture. It inspires future performances that based on successful performances in the past, but it does also continue to perpetuate stereotypes. In some ways this can be good, in some ways it's a little bit iffy on if it's morally correct or not. However, this does help the audience to understand and expect a certain thing, and lets the actors also know what the audience is expecting to make a more successful and coherent performance.